in this video, I'd like to talk to you about leaving your heating off, because nobody can afford to have their heating on at the moment, and a lot of people are contacting us asking us whether they are doing any harm to their building if they leave the heating off. Well, obviously there's the cold, there's the damp, there's the mold that can grow, so a certain amount of heating is essential to keep the building healthy and to keep the mold out. But of course you can do that by ventilating the building. If you've got a good airflow going through a building, very little mold and mildew will build up. It's not a question of just heating it. In fact, sometimes you get more mold and mildew building up because you heat the place, you have all the windows closed and you raise the humidity, and that's what mold and mildew loves. Ventilate if you're not going to have the heating on, put a bit of breeze going through there when you're not in the house, and then close the windows and doors when you come in the house. And that sounds like a pretty miserable existence, doesn't it? Yeah, that's where we've come to these days. So let's just look at the basics. The first thing people are worried about is burst pipes. Obviously, if you don't have the heating on, the building's going to get colder and colder. A building takes several days to cool down. It also takes several days to heat up, especially an older building with a bigger thermal mass. When you've got brick built buildings, then they really take several days for the walls to absorb that heat. But by the same token, if you're going to leave your heating off for several days at a time and the temperature does drop, that's where you're in danger. Now, while we're on the subject of burst pipes, I'd just like to talk about a couple of little myths. I've been going out to burst pipes for very many years. I go out to far fewer than I used to, simply because a lot of people now have combination boilers. They've converted their attics and there is no plumbing up in the loft. In the old days, when you had a tank in the loft and all that was unheated space and you may have nicely insulated your loft, it was very common for the pipes up in the loft to freeze, and it was always one particular pipe that froze. Back before the days when combination boilers really started to take a hold, this is the kind of arrangement you might have in your loft. You would have a feed and expansion tank, which is a small tank which feeds the central heating of the boiler, and you would also have a larger tank like this that fed the hot water cylinder and also often the cold water to your bath. In the winter, you would be having baths, showers, you would be using the water, the hot water as well, and this tank would be in constant operation. So this pipe would be running, it would run last thing at night, first thing in the morning, so it had very little opportunity to freeze up. Even if you had a ceiling down here and you had lots of insulation in here, the fact that this water was on the move all the time would mean that bit of pipework there wouldn't freeze up. Now, the feed and expansion tank is exactly the opposite. A feed and expansion tank is only there to top up the little bit of water in the central heating system. If it evaporates or tiny leaks or anything like that, that water would hardly move. Over the course of a year, you would see very little activity in that tank at all, which means that the water in this pipe going up from the branch where it's fed to the cold water tank, this bit of pipe going up here, and very often we used to mount these high up in the roof space, if you like, to get the maximum head height on our central heating. So this thing would be up here and this pipe would be vulnerable to the cold. You would often find, because this bit was not moving, over days and days and days, the heat would go out of that pipe. Any heat that was in the water would disappear, and even though the pipe was lagged, you may find that you've got a burst on that point there. So what I would do very often, just to keep the thing moving, is if I had a high level feed and expansion tank up here, I would run the pipe up that way and then back down to there, so that at least this water here was moving all the time. That little bit there would probably be influenced by the fact that this water was moving all the time. So a little bit of heating. That's the sort of thing we used to do, but that would be the most vulnerable part of the plumbing in the loft. So if you've still got this kind of arrangement, that would be the one that would be most at risk, if you like. Now, while I'm on the subject of insulating pipes, I just want to talk about another common myth. If you've got a pipe like this, you've got a bit of insulation and you've got a pipe in the middle. The modern insulation is actually very, very thick indeed. So you think, okay, what is that doing? That's keeping the cold out of the pipe. Heat will always travel to cold. So it's not a question of the cold coming in and attacking the pipe. The pipe has a certain amount of heat in it. even if it's water that's just coming from the mains, there's a certain amount of heat in it. It's not frozen, and that heat is in that pipe, even if it's cold water. You've got insulation around the pipe to prevent that heat from escaping to the cold. It's not a question of the cold coming in to find the water. It's the other way round, and that's very important. All the time you've got that little bit of heat in that water, and if the water's being used, then it's being replenished, and you'll always have that little bit of heat coming in. But if that water's sitting still for any kind of period and it's exposed to cold, then the heat will travel to the cold through the insulation. So obviously the more insulation you've got in there, the better. There comes a point, even if you've got a lot of insulation in there, in the end, if you go away for several weeks, if you leave your heating off or something like that, in the end, all the heat has travelled out of that pipe, so that pipe becomes colder and colder and freezes. So then the insulation is doing the exact opposite. And this leads to one of the myths that I used to hear time and time again from people when they said, it's not the freezing of the pipe that bursts the pipe, it's when it thaws. And the reason they thought that was because as the sun comes out and the cold snap finishes and we've got lovely heat all the way around here, that heat would want to travel to cold. So if we've got a frozen pipe inside the insulation, the heat is travelling towards the frozen pipe through the insulation, but because we've got an effective level of insulation around the pipe, it would be several days before this pipe thawed out and the burst became evident. So even though the cold snap was over, everybody's relaxed, they've gone back to normal, they've gone to work and they've come home 2 or 3 days after the cold snap, and they find that they've got a flood on their hands. And that's why people think, oh, it's the thawing that causes the burst pipes. It's the thawing, that's when you find out about the burst pipes. The more insulation you got on a pipe, the longer it's going to take to thaw out once it's been frozen. So what I used to do in some situations is go into people's houses and I would just take the lagging off, peel the lagging back a little bit on the pipes and just warm it up very, very gently with a blow lamp. Now, never ever put a blow lamp on a frozen pipe just in one place, because what you would do there is you bore the water and it's got nowhere to go and the burst pipe will burst and scald you with hot water. So don't ever do that, but you can just gently warm that pipe up with a blow lamp or a hairdryer or something like that, or just leave it exposed for a little while and you will find that it will thaw it out. But that's a common misconception about insulation and pipes. Insulation will not stop pipes from bursting. What it will do is it will slow the process down. It will take longer. And if the pipe is on the move, if the pipe is being used, if you've got water going through it, then you will find that it will probably not freeze up. It's always these static bits of pipe, these pipes out on a limb, and sometimes, by the way, what you also find is you've got a lovely bit of lagging all the way around the pipe and you think you've done a great job and there's just one elbow there that isn't lagged properly and the heat comes out of that pipe at that particular spot and it freezes. And I've seen that where it's just blown the compression fitting off the end of the pipe or something like that, simply because of one tiny little bit of lagging. So if you're going to do lagging, do good lagging. Make sure you do 100% nice mitered corners and nicely taped up so that there's no little spots, because otherwise it's almost as bad as not doing any lagging at all if you leave a small amount exposed. I hope that helps. The other question we're getting asked quite a lot is there any harm if we go away? And obviously if you go away, you should turn your cold water mains off when you go away for 2 or 3 days in the winter or a week or whatever you do. Turn the water off. And then people say, well, I want to leave my heating on. Is there any danger in leaving the heating on if I have the cold mains off? So there is no danger in leaving that cold water mains off if you've got the heating on. You just leave it off and leave the thing to do its own thing. It's very, very unlikely that in those situations you would have a burst pipe or any kind of emergency. But if you did, it doesn't mean that your boiler or your hot water cylinder are going to blow up. So if you've got any other questions that you want to ask us about this or any other subject related to building, then please get in touch. Here's the details on the screen now of where you can get in touch with us. We're getting loads of questions in, but we do try our best to answer them. We'll obviously answer the more interesting ones.